Welcome to the second lecture of the series of this course called Basic Cognitive Processes. I am Dr. Ark Verma, Assistant Professor of Psychology in IIT Kanpur. The title of today's lecture is A Brief History of Cognitive Psychology. In this lecture, we will talk about the historical antecedents of cognitive psychology. But even before we do that, let us spend a moment to think about why history of cognitive psychology is important. In today's lecture, what I will do is I will take you through the development of the ideas of cognitive psychology. I will talk about how the ideas related to mind and behavior originated in the ancient Greek schools of philosophy. We will also see how later philosophers contributed to the growth of this idea, and then we will go into various schools of thought that emerged in psychology. From there, we will go to the place where the ideas about cognition and cognitive psychology, the ideas about mental processes take shape, and that basically leads to the current and contemporary form of inquiry, that is cognitive psychology. Now, why is doing all of this necessary? Why do I want to actually do this in today's lecture? There are two simple reasons. One of them is that going through this historical chart of how these ideas developed, what we will be doing is we will be seeing how a particular idea, which seems rather commonsensical, has been approached through a variety of perspectives from ancient times to the more recent times. We have to talk about also that how various people contributed in the growth and the development of this idea. There have been contributors from a variety of disciplines towards this discipline of cognitive psychology, and in this lecture today I would ask you to make those connections. So, it will be very important that you pay attention to how this particular idea of cognitive psychology actually develops from philosophy onwards, and it comes and with the inputs from even fields like artificial intelligence or computer science takes form of inquiry, which is known currently as cognitive psychology. Let us go to the roots of this word called psychology. The word psychology basically derives from the combination of two Latin words. The first word basically is psyche or soul. The second word is logia, which is the study of. So, psychology basically defined means the study of the soul. Now, I would like you to take a moment and wonder what soul would mean here. Basically, by referring to the soul, those ancient Greek philosophers were basically talking about what we probably today refer as the mind. Anything that a person does, we actually look for causes, we actually look for reasons why and how the person is being able to do that or accomplish that particular behavior. All of that in ancient times was basically attributed to this thing called the soul. So, that is why it is logical to expect people to start talking about the soul as the seat of human behavior. We will see how that actually pans out in ancient philosophy. So, origins of psychology then basically can be actually traced down to these two more basic disciplines, which are philosophy and physiology. Now, philosophy, as you know, is a discipline that seeks to explore and explain human nature through introspection. It also uses the tools of thought like epistemology, logic, etc. Now, the subject matter of philosophy, if you see, is basically thought. Okay? So, philosophy is concerned with how human behavior or how this world can be explained by analyzing and reanalyzing what we think. Okay? And philosophy also uses tools to actually analyze this process of thought, say for example, tools like logic. Physiology, on the other hand, focuses on the body. It is a discipline that is dedicated to understanding the functioning of the human body, the biological aspects of it, how a particular organ is constituted, how it functions, and those questions. So, psychology, you will see, basically focuses on the interaction of the mind and body. That is why psychology takes into account approaches both from philosophy and physiology. So, this is basically what the roots of psychology are. Now, surprisingly, actually, if we go back in time, one of the first reported experiments in psychology can actually be traced back down to the Egyptian times. There is no reason to believe that similar experiments were not being done in the different other civilizations, but here is this experiment. An ancient king of Egypt as far back as the 7th century BC actually wanted to conduct the first experiment. He had this idea that if children were raised in isolation from infancy and were given no instruction in language of any kind, the language that they actually end up speaking will be the original language of man, or the language of the original human civilization. So he wanted to test this out. Okay, so he actually raises a child in isolation and does that, and basically finds out that the child ends up not speaking anything. So his hypothesis is actually not confirmed. But even though this experiment fails to support the king's hypothesis, Morton Hunt observes that it does illustrate perhaps the first evidence in written history that as long as around 2700 years ago, there was at least one individual with this highly original notion that mental processes could be systematically investigated first, and mental processes could be studied, and they have something to do with the body. Okay. So, this is a very interesting piece of anecdotal evidence that actually tells us that people have been intrigued with this subject matter of human behavior, of human mind, and that is something which is basically been around with us for a long time. Now, let us visit the philosophical antecedents of psychology, the basic thought processes in psychology that that actually gave rise to the questions we ask now. Now, you might be aware that one of the first things in earlier days, when somebody was trying to explain a mental illness of sort, was that person X, who's basically experiencing mental illness of kind Y, is basically affected by some demons, some ghosts, or some spirits. Now, those kind of explanations were very popular, and which led to things like witch hunting and people being prosecuted and those kind of things. Hippocrates, as far back as 460 or 300 BC, basically was one of the first to propose that mental illness was not caused by demons, but by genuine physical conditions. So, you see, Hippocrates is basically one of the first who is making this connection between the mind and the body. Hippocrates actually worked by dissecting human corpses and living organisms, and through his experiments in these kinds of physiology, concluded that it is the mind that controlled the body. Further, he proposed that mind basically resides in the head or in the brain. Now, this is one of the first times that actually behavior is being linked to something with body. Another person, Plato, another philosopher who was basically also one of the most influential philosophers of all time, suggested that reality basically exists in our minds completely, and that head is the seat of the mind, much like Hippocrates has observed recently. Now, Plato is basically suggesting that knowledge is gained through thinking and analysis of thought. Okay, and this is what basically is our effort to understand this world or the happenings of this world. So, Plato basically suggests that mind and body are different things, but they might interact in some way or the other. Due to his emphasis on this whole process of thinking and thought as the source of knowledge, Plato has been termed as a rationalist. Moving ahead, Aristotle, who is basically a disciple of Plato, actually felt quite the opposite. Aristotle felt that mind and body were one and the same. Contrary to what his teacher Plato has talked about, Aristotle actually says that we can understand the mind by studying the body. So, he is saying that mind and body are basically the same thing, and if you are studying the body, you might eventually end up studying the mind as well. He says that relying on concrete objects and actions rather than thoughts should be our scope of inquiry, or should be our scope of study. He says that reality lies in the concrete world. His methods were basically built upon observations of concrete facts, numbers, and those kinds of things, and that is why Aristotle was regarded as an empiricist. Now, let us move on to a more modern bunch of thinkers, philosophers, but not from the Greek era, but from somewhere close to us in time. One of the most influential philosophers who basically really shaped the subject matter of psychology was Rene Descartes. Rene Descartes basically was a French philosopher and mathematician. He said that introspection and reflection are better methods than observation. Now, Descartes, you might want to know, basically believed that our observations are a result of the workings of our senses, and he believed that these senses can actually make mistakes. He talked about particular kinds of illusions wherein your senses will end up making mistakes. Say for example, if you stare at a point of light for a few minutes, and after that you will experience a sensation of darkness even though there is no darkness outside. So, Descartes basically believed that because our senses can be fooled or our senses can actually make mistakes, we should actually rely on observation rather than the information coming to us from our senses. Descartes said that mind and body are two separate things, though he said that these two things interact through a seat in the head between a pineal gland. Descartes laid so much importance on thought and analysis, and that importance can actually be seen reflected in this statement that he makes, which is cogito ergo sum, which basically translates to I think, therefore I am. So, for Descartes, the source of reality of this world basically lies in your thought and in your analysis of the world, using which you understand the happenings of the world. John Locke came after Descartes. He basically said that the relationship between the mind and body is sort of an equal relationship, wherein these two things are the two forms of one and the same thing. Okay. So, Locke basically says that mind depends upon the body through its senses, and the body depends upon the mind to process and store this information that is gained through the senses. So, Locke actually is giving something which is you might say rather revolutionary, because he is actually going on and saying that mind and body are one and the same thing, and there is a definite way through which this interaction is taking place. Locke was also an empiricist, and he believed in the thought of tabula rasa. Tabula rasa basically means that all human beings are born as blank slates in this world. Everything that they learn, everything that they finally achieve or accomplish, any kind of behavior is learned by their interaction with this world. Another important philosopher was Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant basically says that humans have a set of faculties, things like mental functions we talked about in the last class. So, he said that these faculties, which are your senses, the faculties of understanding, faculties of reason, these are the tools which basically work together to control this link between the mind and body. So, by now it is clear that mind and body are two things, maybe same, maybe separate, but there is an interaction certainly going on between them. And different people now are proposing different ways in which this interaction is taking place. So, Immanuel Kant basically says that these are the faculties, these are the mental functions through which there is this interaction between mind and body that is going on. Now, let us take a brief pause, let us look back and let us see where we have reached from ancient Greece to more contemporary philosophers, or not really contemporary, to more modern philosophers. So, early thinkers, these early thinkers which we talked about have basically laid out the broad subject matter of what psychology is. And this subject matter is nothing other than this relationship between the mind and the body. We will elaborate upon this issue in more detail when we are actually talking about the foundational assumptions in cognitive psychology, but by this point you should be clear that this is something which is most important to as questions to cognitive psychologists. Even now people are constantly investigating what is mind and how does it relate to the body. Mind in the earlier days could be studied through various ways. Observable behavior was to be one of the more important ways. Also, body on the other hand could be studied via the biological or the neural substrates. So, if you want to study the connection between the mind and the body and say for example, you want to investigate the body, which is basically the brain, you have fields like neuroscience which will actually tell you about how the brain is constructed or how the brain really affects your behavior. Mind, on the other hand, is this body of mental functions which we will see how they evolve and how they are actually structured. Now, this entire preface of philosophy actually led to development of various kinds of thought or various kinds of thought systems in psychology. These thought systems have been organized as schools of thought. Each school of thought has one or more prominent thinkers, and it is these thinkers whose opinion forms the basis of this entire school of thought. Okay, so we'll examine how these different schools of thought contributed to the growth and to the evolution of something that is cognitive psychology. One of the first and the foremost schools of thought in psychology was structuralism. Structuralism was founded by Wilhelm Wundt, who was basically a psychologist in Germany, who also established the first psychology lab in Leipzig in Germany. Wilhelm Wundt basically focused on the nature of consciousness. He actually wanted to explain what consciousness is. He actually wanted to explain the components which form human experience. Wilhelm Wundt believed that it was possible to analyze the basic elements of the mind and conscious experience. If you talk to Wundt, he might be able to tell you that the feeling of happiness is composed of X, Y and Z smaller components, or the experience of actually being in a particular place in a particular time can actually be boiled down to these smaller components. This is on the basis of this main stream of thought, Wundt found this school of which is basically known as structuralism. Now, structuralists basically aimed to identify the basic elements or cognitive of the cognitive psychological experience. They wanted to create something similar to the periodic table, which basically had all of these elements of consciousness. Structuralists use the method of introspection to attempt this map. They wanted to, they basically, in a typical Wundtian lab, if you are a participant there, the psychologist might just ask you to relax, to sit down and to report as truthfully as possible, in as detailed a manner as possible, whatever you are experiencing at any point in time, or for example, whatever you are experiencing while you are engaged in a particular task. Say for example, you are given a flower to see and you are actually experiencing this flower, you might want to record that you are actually seeing a shape, you are seeing a particular color, you are smelling a particular odor and you are actually feeling a particular texture when you are touching or holding that flower. This is the detail, this is the componential structure of experience that the structuralists were actually emphasizing on. Further, structuralists were actually using things like reaction times as a measure to systematically assess the workings of the mind. So, what they would do is they would actually try and log while you are experiencing certain steps, and with that they will deduce how much time a particular step took, and they could actually try and deduce then that what are the basic components of any experience and how much time it took everyone to go through those sets of experiences. Say for example, if I actually play a sound in your headphones, or say for example, if I play a sound here and if I ask you to identify that sound, one of the first things that you will be able to register is that there is a sound being played. So, the first thing that you will do is actually detection of the fact that there is a sound. This basically refers to what sensation is. The second thing that you might go on to experience is that you might be able to actually recognize the sound or the song, let us say, which I am playing. This recognition of that song is basically identification. That is what perception is about when the knowledge is in the scope of your awareness. So, Wundt and the structuralists basically found that identification took longer than detection. You might logically try and connect that first you detect, it takes a bit of a less time, and then you try and identify what the song is, it takes a bit more after you have really detected that there is a sound at least. So, this is how the Wundtian school of psychologists distinguish between sensation and perception. They are actually following a rather scientific method. Edward Titchener, one of the disciples of Wilhelm Wundt, basically claimed to identify more than 40,000 sensations such as vision, hearing, taste, and so many others. This method or this approach followed by the structuralists were rather rigorous and very, very scientific. They were actually trying to quantify mental events, they were actually trying to quantify the human experience. But they had a bit of a problem because the main method they were actually using was that of introspection. Now, you may take a pause and ask yourself what is wrong with introspection. And I might now tell you that introspection, basically one of the things that is wrong with introspection is that knowledge gained through introspection is not verifiable. Science is about verifying, proving to the others that something exists. In that sense, introspection was probably not the best of the methods to follow. That is one of the shortcomings that the structuralist schools of psychologists were having. Let us move to the next school, functionalism. Many of you would have heard that William James is sometimes referred to as the father of psychology. William James basically belonged to this school of thought which is termed as functionalism. Now, functionalism is characteristic in a way that functionalists seek to not only understand what people do, which the structuralists were also trying to do, but the functionalists were also concerned with why people do certain things, why do certain behaviors take place. Okay, so they are interested in studying how the mind works, yes, but also why the mind works as it does. So, the questions the structuralists, the functionalists were asking were slightly different and let us say a bit more advanced than the questions earlier asked. The functionalists believed in using whatever methods that would answer a particular researcher's question. They are not really too much about the methods, but more about the kind of questions that are being asked. Now, this movement or this stance of functionalism gradually leads to what is known as pragmatism. Now, pragmatism is also one of the popular approaches in psychology, which basically is concerned about the fact that knowledge is valuable only for what it is, only for its usefulness. You might know certain thing, you might have certain skills, but what are you using them for? That is basically what the functionalists wanted to say. So, the pragmatists wanted to say. The pragmatists therefore would be interested in studying phenomena in a way that how these phenomena will help you attain certain things. Say for example, if you ask a pragmatist to study language, a pragmatist would want to study language to actually understand how language helps you communicate your thoughts. So, they would really want to study language, but only to the extent that it tells you or that it helps you accomplish particular kinds of behavior. Now, from structuralism and functionalism, gradually they developed another school of psychology or another school of thought in psychology, that is associationism. Another influential way of thinking in psychology, associationism basically examines how the elements of the mind like ideas, feelings, etc. can become associated with one another. One of the ways, say for example, how things get associated with each other is contiguity or happening close in time. Say for example, some of you might while you are going somewhere, there is a cat that crosses your path. Maybe just after the cat crossed your path, you meet with an accident. Now, just because these two events happen close in time together, you might want to, or some of us might want to really link these two events. So, this is one of the ways people generally link two events that happen close in time together. Another way could be by virtue of contrast. So, there could be feelings or ideas that could be exact opposite of each other. Say for example, feeling very elated or feeling very depressed, or feeling happy, feeling sad, or say for example, things like experience of hotness or experiences of coldness. So, this is also one of the ways we actually link two ideas or two experiences together. Hermann Ebbinghaus was one of the earlier psychologists who basically used these principles in associationism more systematically. He studied his own mental processes and made up a list of nonsense syllables that consisted of a consonant, a vowel and then a he basically constructed lists of words like these, zat, cax, nad, etc., etc., which basically he tried to later memorize. So he basically he was very careful. He took careful note of how long it took him to memorize each of these lists, how many errors he would make, and he recorded the response times as well. Through these self-observations, Ebbinghaus studied how people learn to remember material through a process like rehearsal, which is basically the conscious repetition of material, something which we mostly and commonly do. Now, through his experiments, Ebbinghaus actually finds out that it is the first few repetitions, the first early form of rehearsal that actually leads to most learning, while later attempts at rehearsal basically don't give us that kind of output. Edward Thorndike was another psychologist who was basically working with these principles of associationism. He basically was interested in investigating the role of satisfaction. He says that there is he basically gives out a principle called the principle of law of effect, which says that a stimulus will tend to produce a certain response over time if an organism is rewarded for that response. So, an organism basically learns to respond to a particular stimulus in a given situation if it is rewarded to behave like. Say for example, if there is a kid and you want to teach the kid something, or say for example, if there is a animal or a pet and you want to teach that animal something, you might want to teach that animal to stand up on its two hind legs. Now, you will have to reward the animal repeatedly over time to actually make him learn that kind of behavior. Now, we will wrap up over here. And we will in the next class talk about other aspects in the history of psychology that finally led to the shaping of what cognitive psychology actually is. Thank you.